Tell me if you have ever had a similar experience to this. I recall when I was in my early 20s or so, I was with my family at the beach, and I refused to take off my shirt because, well, I was kind of embarrassed. I was ashamed because I looked at the people on the blanket next to us, and there was this cowboy, and he had the muscles, you know. I knew he was a cowboy because he wore a cowboy hat. You know, he had on his cowboy hat, his swimming trunks, his sandals, whatever. And there was me. By comparison, I thought, oh my goodness, people are going to think I am so out of shape. I'm just going to keep my shirt on. So I was ashamed. Well, you know what? After maybe a half hour, I don't know, I started getting hot. And I thought about it. And I said, you know, who cares? I don't know these people. They don't know me. We'll never see each other again. If they think I'm out of shape, do I really care what they think? Why am I so embarrassed and so ashamed of what I look like? So I took off my shirt. And I just happened to notice when I did that the cowboy on the blanket next to us took off his hat. And guess what? He was bald. I mean, we're talking, he had a little hair around the side, but we're talking Dr. Phil bald. And it occurred to me that he was wearing his hat for the same reason that I was wearing my shirt. Kind of embarrassed. Don't want people to see us. By comparison, I guess in his mind, and I'm not a mind reader, I don't know this is what he was thinking, but in his mind, he was probably thinking, all these guys with their hair, and here I am, looking like a Hare Krishna, except for a little bit on the side. And he was probably thinking the same thing I was thinking. Who cares what people think? You know? So have you had one of those life experiences where you were so embarrassed, you were so ashamed, simply because you're comparing yourself to other people, and you cared what they thought? For no apparent reason, but it's just a little bit... Well, I don't want to say selfish, but yeah, we've got egos. We care about ourselves, about self-esteem, and we don't want to let down our guard, even when it's silly not to do so. Well, with that thought in mind, have you ever been embarrassed, or have you ever been ashamed of having Aspergers Syndrome? Well, let's talk about that in a little bit of detail. This is not going to be a very long presentation, but I've got 6 things. 3 things when Aspie should not be ashamed, and 3 things when, well, yeah, maybe we should be a little bit ashamed. And the last one of the 6, 3 of each, the last one of the 6 is one you're going to want to really pay close attention to, because that's what ties this all together. So when should Aspies not be ashamed? Well, number 1 is when you can't help being yourself. Why should you be ashamed of who you are? Now, sometimes, you know, we are a little bit embarrassed because we find ourselves rocking, or we try to talk to somebody. We don't really want to make small talk, but out it comes because we feel pressure to do so, and we're just kind of embarrassed. We're ashamed, because we simply do not have that innate ability to carry on a simple, I mean the simplest of conversations, like everybody else can, or everybody else seems to be able to. It's kind of like comparing yourself with a cowboy in the blanket next to you. You want to fit in. You want to be part of the landscape so that you are normal, because you feel like you are less than normal because you can't make small talk like everyone else, because you can't make eye contact as effectively as everyone else, because you come across as being like, I don't know, a space alien, a lizard, one of those lizard people they talk about, and so you're just kind of embarrassed of who you are. But when you stop and think about it, nature has made you this way. Now, what would happen if everybody was ashamed of who they are? And you know what? I think to some degree, just about everybody is. I recall a couple of years ago, I was, where was I? I think I was I was in I was going to say a Burger King, but I was in a hamburger store somewhere. And there was a pretty good crowd there, but there was this pretty teenage girl. And I overheard her conversation with an older woman, and this teenage girl was explaining how embarrassed she was with her nose. I looked at her and I thought, man, there's nothing wrong with this girl's nose. What is wrong with her? Well, the point being that I think everybody has their insecurities. Everybody has their moments of embarrassment. Everybody thinks, I could be a little bit more attractive. I could have a little bit better personality. Now, some people go over the top and they're just flat out narcissistic. They think nobody's as good as they are. But when you look deep down inside of that, you discover what they're really doing is covering insecurities. Those narcissistic people, they are sometimes the most insecure people. And they go way, way, way out of the way to hide their insecurities. Think of the guy in the cowboy hat, What if he had worn a huge cowboy hat? Because he really wanted to cover his insecurities. He would draw more attention to himself doing that than if he just took off his hat. He looks more silly, with a big hat than he does with a bald head. And by the way, the guy did not look bad at all with a bald head. It was just self-reflection, I guess. I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what he was thinking, but sometimes we self-reflect. We'll talk about that some more in just a moment. Number 2 is this. When you can help being yourself, but hey, you're not hurting anybody, why should you be ashamed? Sometimes I catch myself stimming when I'm out in public, particularly in a restaurant, just sitting there doing nothing, start stimming. And I catch myself. And for years, I used to consciously try to stop. But after a therapist informed me that I did, in fact, have Aspergers Syndrome, that I was on the autism spectrum, somehow it occurred to me, why am I so worried about this? I mean, this is who I am. Who cares? I'm not hurting anybody. So nowadays, you see me sitting in a restaurant somewhere, you'll see me sitting there rocking back and forth. Not hurting anybody. Why should I be ashamed? Why should you be ashamed? Embrace who you are. Accept yourself for who you are, for what you are. Number 3 is this. And this seems kind of silly, but not until you dig deep down inside of it. But you should never be ashamed of being an Aspie when you are alone. Now, sometimes we have this thing where we will ruminate. We'll stop and think, and we'll stop and consider, what would life be like if I had not made that blunder that I made earlier today? And that just rolls over and over in our mind. We get real concerned about the mistake we made, the words that we said that we shouldn't have said. And we think about things. Sometimes we go back months and years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe 50 years. I'm approaching 70 years old, so I can actually remember. 50 years ago, kids come up and ask me about history, and I say, yeah, I remember that. But we sometimes ruminate about silly mistakes that we made because we are asked these things that we said, ways that we presented ourselves, and the people that we affected have probably forgotten about it. They're not sitting around ruminating about what you said to them. I mean, maybe they are, but if they are, that's their flaw. It's not yours. But yeah, one of the mistakes that we make, I think, and I say ashamed, maybe that's not the best word for this, but when we what is the word? Overthink? The term rather, overthink about things that we should not even be thinking about. I mean, okay, you made a mistake, you learn, you move on. Okay, those are times when Aspies should not be ashamed. But are there times when we should be ashamed? Well, initially, when I was putting this together, I was thinking, why should I ever be ashamed of being an Aspie? I mean, that's who I am. But then when I started drilling down in my mind, it occurred to me that, there are some times when people with particular traits will use those traits to manipulate other people. I can't help myself. That's the way I was. You'll have to get over it. I'm an Aspie. What do you expect? Yeah, we should be ashamed when we do that intentionally just so we can manipulate other people, so we can get our own way. Or maybe we do it so that we can transfer our shame onto them. Yeah, projection. Vicariously, we're taking our embarrassment and we're loading it onto somebody else. We're just being a little bit, when we do that, we're just being a little bit self-centered, a little bit manipulative. And sometimes it's not a little bit, sometimes it's quite a bit. So when should Aspies be ashamed? Well, the second thing is when seeking unwarranted sympathy and empathy. Now, that's kind of like the first thing, but not exactly. I think that everybody likes to know that other people care about them. Now, this, in my mind, my way of thinking, and tell me if you disagree, but this is just kind of immature. Because when we were kids, remember that you could manipulate people by crying. You felt like you were hurt. Your feelings were hurt. And so you start bawling, you start crying, just to get your parents to pat you on the little head and maybe get yourself out of trouble. Make it seem like it's all about, oh man, it's all about me and you should care about me. But really, that's just another way of being manipulated. Now, when we do that, yeah, I think maybe we should be ashamed of misusing our traits just to solicit empathy or sympathy or both from others. Feel sorry for me because, hey, I'm an Aspie. Number 3 is this. This is the final thing, and I think this is so important, and that is this. We should be ashamed when unnecessarily embarrassing other people. Now, this may be a little bit challenging because, hey, again, we are who we are the way we are, but sometimes we don't have to do what we do or be the way we are or talk the way we talk or don't talk the way we don't talk if it hurts other people. Now, what would happen, stop and think of it in this context, what would happen if everybody did that all the time? When everybody behaved in such a way that it would just embarrass other people. Now, when we go places, in society, there are norms of behavior that is expected of us. For example, if you go to a formal dinner party, you're expected to behave in a certain manner. And if you go to a dinner party acting like you're at a birthday party, you're embarrassing people, especially people who, family and friends. You're making them look stupid because they're hanging out with you, and you really don't have to. Now, I don't know that anybody would go to that extreme where you go to a formal dinner party and you start acting like it's a birthday party. But, there are more subtle times when we can be conscious of our surroundings. And, we need to learn, and I think all of us have done this, but we need to learn to adapt to the norms of our surroundings, social surroundings, the best we possibly can. And we say, who cares? I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care who it hurts. I don't care who it embarrasses. I'm going to do it anyhow. That goes back to being like a little kid. We're just being selfish. Does infighting seem kind of pointless to you? I mean, you just don't get it. Why is it that people fight? You go to work and these people are having this fight. You don't even know what they're fighting over. They're just disagreeing, or maybe it's in your extended family, or maybe it's in your church. I never understood this in church. I thought people were supposed to go to church to get together and to love one another. But now they get together and they gossip and they fight. I don't get that. Do you get it? That's one of 8 questions I've got for you, and that is some unusual traits of Asperger's syndrome that are really secondary traits of primary traits. And let's go through, and I just want to ask you some of these questions to see if see what you think, and you can use the comment section to answer the questions. But yeah, infighting. That's something I never could understand. I don't understand why people hate each other because they disagree with each other. What does that have to do with anything? Did you hurt somebody because you disagree with them? I don't think so. I mean, there may be some exceptions to that, but I just can't get it. Let me know what you think. All right, number 2 is this, and I'm going to have to move kind of quick because we got 8 of these questions, and I don't want to make this presentation too terribly long because, well, then it gets kind of boring. But number 2 is this. Do you have what I call poker face? Now, when I say poker face, I mean that you have a face that is really void of expressions. When you're talking to somebody, they may raise their eyebrows or make a face of some kind that looks perfectly normal to you, but when you are listening to them, or maybe even talking to them, which we don't like to do a lot of that, but your expression, it just doesn't reflect that. Those mirror neurons apparently aren't kicking in. So you have a poker face. Now the problem with this is that we can't see our face when we're talking. So we don't necessarily know that we are not expressing ourselves the way other people would, unless somebody actually tells us that. I know when I started making videos, I thought I had expressions like everybody else. But when I watched the video, I realized, you thought you were expressing yourself very well with your body language and with your facial language, but as I watched the videos, I thought, man, I'm missing it. So I tried to exaggerate just a little bit, but not too much. That's a bit of a challenge because we don't know when we are overdoing it. Now, here's another problem. With poker face, and I say it's a problem, not a big problem, but did you know that you can see your reflection in other people? That if you are happy, the person you're talking to will reflect that happiness. If you are mad, you can see that anger reflected in other people. So another way to tell whether or not you have poker face is when you are interacting with people, which I know you don't like to do that too much. But when you are interacting with other people, you don't get much of a reflection back. But then again, maybe you're accustomed to that, so you don't notice it. But it is something that going forward, you may want to pay close attention to. When you are interacting with other people, how do they react to your interaction? And if their reaction is kind of flat, okay, you've got flat expression. You've got poker face. Pretty good, I guess, if you're playing poker, but life is not one big poker game. Okay, maybe it is. I don't know. Question number 3 is this. Did you struggle with your peers when you were little, when you were a child growing up? And when I say struggle, I don't mean necessarily fight. And that, by the way, is something else that I don't understand. Talking about infighting is why do people bully each other? It's just pointless, but that's off topic here. Did you struggle with other kids when you were a child? Now, adults usually thought you were great. Little Johnny or whoever you are is so well behaved. He is so, when you get to be a teenager, they say, well, he or she is so mature for their age. Well, maybe so. Maybe there is something mature about having Asperger's syndrome. I say maybe, I actually think there is, because we don't like infighting. We don't like all this social hierarchy forming where somebody tries to compete with another person for position in the social hierarchy. It's just dumb, it's immature, it's childish, but most people do that. So I'm thinking just maybe the people with Aspergers syndrome may actually be, at least on that level, maybe a little bit more mature than their peers, not just in childhood, but throughout life. But that's another question. So as you are assessing your level of autism, specifically Aspergers syndrome, did you, as a child, struggle, not necessarily fight, even though that might have been part of it, but struggle just interacting socially with other kids? And one of the things they may have been bothered by was your unusually high verbal skills. You would use words and terms that maybe the other kids didn't understand, and you came across as just kind of weird. Which is number 4. Do you have unusually high verbal skills? Not every person that I know who has Asperger's syndrome has. Can we actually call this a problem? Seems to me this would be a benefit if you have high verbal skills. But not everyone I know who has Asperger's syndrome finds this trait to be prevalent in their lives, but most of them do. And I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm sure somebody's done some research, but I have no idea why that is. But I think it may be because, we have that tendency, we're going to talk about this in just a second, we have a tendency for things to be in place, for things to be in order. And we like it done well. And sometimes we prefer to choose the most expressive word or the word that is most accurately expressive or whatever. And so we just tend to, and I'm just theorizing here, I don't know. And so we tend to expand our vocabulary. All right, number 5 is this. Are you unusually tidy? Now, as you look at my office, I think you can see it on the screen. Does that look tidy to you? I see a few things that are out of place, few things that are askew, but by and large, I keep things straight and in order, but not always. So I can't say that I am excessively tidy, even though I do like things in a row. I don't know why. If they're dusty, that doesn't bother me, so. But I certainly am no hoarder. And if you watch those shows, the hoarders, see if you can find a person with Asperger's syndrome who is a hoarder. Maybe there's one out there. I don't know, but I doubt it. That is just something that is that is contradictory to everything that is Aspie. Asperger's syndrome, people with Asperger's syndrome, we like things to be in order. And again, that's not something that is really prevalent in my life, but still, I keep my shirts in order. I call it micro order because you keep your house in order, but then you keep everything in your house in order, like your closets. Some people laugh at me when I tell them this, but I actually number my shirts. I have 17 shirts that look just like this one. Different colors, but they're all the same. And I number them, and the reason I do that is so that I won't wind up wearing the same shirt over and over and over again and wear it out. So I want to, this day I wear shirt number 1, tomorrow I'll wear shirt number 2, the next day I wear shirt number 3, so I don't wear them out. So that's kind of a form of tidiness, but really what we're doing is we're keeping things in order. Talk about that in a couple minutes. Number 6 is this. Do you not get social interactions? Now, this kind of reflects on the other question we asked about the question we ask about infighting, why do people infight? Why don't they just get along? Don't understand that, but a part of that is you don't understand social interactions. That a lot of social interactions, at least to me, and I think this is true with a lot of people with Asperger's syndrome, are pointless. Now, I didn't realize that I did this so much, but people would ask me questions, and I would say, I don't know. That was my question. That was my answer, rather, to probably a million questions. And when I went in for my evaluation, That was one of the things the therapist brought up. Is I had this tendency to say, I don't know, if I didn't know the answer to the question, I wouldn't just converse for no apparent reason. I don't know. But it means more than I don't know. It means that's a dumb question. It also means who cares? It also means you should know the answer to that, so why are you asking me? Or it could mean that's unnecessarily or just unnecessary small talk. So my response is, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. I didn't think that was a big deal. But, well, another expression is whatever, But I was watching the movie Rain Man, and there's a scene in it where Raymond says, I don't know. He would say, I don't know.
How'd you do that? I don't know.
Over and over. And the Tom Cruise character, forget his name, he got really annoyed with Raymond, Rain Man, because he said, I don't know. You don't know? You should know. And it didn't occur to me that, that was a portrayal of a person with autism, or on the autism spectrum, kind of a severe case of it. And that's very reflective in my life, and I didn't even get it until after I talked to the therapist, and I don't know. Problem solved. End of conversation. Talk about something else, or go away, or quit talking altogether. But we just don't get social interactions. Why is somebody asking me a question about that thing? I don't know. Number 7 is this. Do you prefer routines? We like things in order, not just physical things in order, but we like our actions in order. Do you prefer routines? Now, when I went to see the therapist to get my diagnosis, she asked me this question, and I said, no, I don't particularly like routines. I mean, routines are not a part of my life. And after the session was over, I went home and I got on the computer and looked up my spreadsheet to see what I was supposed to do next. And I thought about it. I do things routinely, like order my shirts. I have a schedule. I do this around the house once a month or once a week or whatever. Maybe I do have routines. I guess, I was thinking to myself, I guess if you do things routinely, you must have routines. And so I sent her an email and I said, yeah, I want to change my answer on that. It just occurred to me that I have all kinds of routines. I just didn't think of them as being routines. I just had an orderly life. Well, I guess that's part of having a routine. Number 8, this is the last one, and that is this. Does non-literal language confuse you? Now, if you are a person with Aspergers Syndrome, you've probably already heard this question, because this is the one that's not all that unusual. But I don't think I have a real problem with understanding analogies and non-literal language. Raining cats and dogs is the one that everybody brings up, and I know it's not raining I was going to say canned hams, because that's what David Letterman used to say. But I understand it's not raining cats and dogs. I'm not confused by that at all. But I think a lot of people with Aspergers Syndrome have that problem. Do you? Now, I heard a story, and this is probably one of the most extreme stories I ever heard, but there was a couple who was visiting the home of another couple for they had them over for dinner. And they had a good time, I guess. And as this couple was leaving at the end of the evening, the host couple said to their guest couple as they were walking down the sidewalk to get in their car, come back and see us. So they turned around, they went back in the house. They went back to see him. Okay, that's an extreme case, and I don't think it happens all that much, but that's the idea, is you tend to take things a little bit too literal, and you don't always know, and this is the problem. Some people tell jokes with that poker face. And you may not know they're joking. And you may not get the joke until you find out they're joking. That, okay, that was funny. Thanks for scaring me. But you know, sometimes we don't get it, and we don't even know we don't get it, and it's too late. It's in the past. It's gone. We talk about this stuff all the time, Aspergers Syndrome, and it just goes on and on. And the material we have on this channel is, well, it just doesn't get old. We call it evergreen. What we talked about last year, what we talked about last month, is still good information. So, you know, help yourself. As you can probably see, I am currently sitting in a one-room cabin. So think of this cabin as an analogy of the typical or neurotypical brain. It's got basically one room. Everything happens in that room. But if you are an Aspie, the way that I see this is you have a brain that has multiple rooms. And you can't be in two rooms at the same time. You're either in one room or you're in the other room or another room. So how many rooms are there in the Aspie brain? Well, I've identified 3 of them, and let me ask you if you can identify with this concept of having multiple rooms in your brain. Now, some people call this, or they may confuse this with multiple personality disorder. Nowadays, they call it something different. It's called dissociative identity disorder. But the idea is that you have more than one personality, and I don't think so. At least not relating to people with Aspergers Syndrome. I think that we have one personality, but just like you have one house, but it has several different rooms in the same house. Or another way to phrase it is you don't have a split personality, you have a conjoined personality. Still you, just one you, but different. You express yourself differently based upon circumstances. Now, people who live in one-room brains, they behave differently based on circumstances, but it's a matter of choice. It's what they understand. This circumstance calls for this behavior. And so they accommodate the circumstances by behaving appropriately. Whereas with people with Asperger's Syndrome, I notice that many times they are in circumstances and they don't willfully change rooms. They just can't help it. There's something about that circumstance that switches their brain to a different level of functioning. So here are the 3 that we have identified, and I'm sure there are more rooms, and if you can think of some, just notify us in the comment section. All right, room number 1 is this. It's what I call the confident room. That is the room in which we have the greatest confidence. And I've noticed typically this happens when we are alone. So we're home alone, or we're maybe in the car, whatever. We have we're just typical. We're just normal like everybody else. There is no inhibition. There is no fear. There is no problem with eye contact you're going to look at. So we have this absolute positive confidence like other people have, neurotypical people have, when they're in a crowd. But as soon as we get into a crowd, then this compartmentalizing takes place because we find ourselves in an entirely, totally different room. Okay, what room do we find ourselves in now? Well, this would be the social room, or maybe we could call this the self-conscious room. So something happens, something shifts in our brain. We have moved into this other compartment when we are around other people. 1 second ago, we were by ourselves, totally confident, the true us, and now we are in a social environment, and now we are self-conscious. We are no longer confident. We have difficulty talking. We can't make eye contact. It's like a different brain has taken over, but really it hasn't. We just moved into that other room. For example, a good example of this, I know some people, they do people with Asperger's Syndrome, Aspergians, They do very well with one-on-one job interviews. Now, many of them don't, but some of them do very well with one-on-one job interviews. And the person doing the hiring, the human resources department or personnel, very impressed with the way this person comes across. Cool. That's something akin to the confident room. But then, okay, you're hired and the person goes to work. The person with Aspergers Syndrome is placed into this work environment where they have to deal with other people. Well, now what? Well, now what happens is they are in the social room. They're in the inhibition room where they're very inhibited. They are in the self-conscious room. These are different names for the social room. And they know they're different. They know that they have this, I don't want to call it a fear, but in a sense it's kind of a fear. They don't know how to change it because they can't change it because you can't be in two rooms at the same time. So they stay in that room until work is over. Then they get in their car and guess what? They're all alone. They're back in their confident room again. They get home and they like being in their confident room, and so they stay alone as much as they can because they really don't like the frustration of being in a social environment because, again, lack of confidence, overwhelming inhibition, very, very, very self-conscious. Don't like that at all. So we get out of that room whenever possible and we go back to our confident room, which is our lone room. Well, there is a third room that I've identified. And again, I think there are many rooms in our brains, but you can think of some. Tell us about it in the comments. But this is what I call the confusion room. Aspies are very gifted at focusing. That is to say, if they have a project in front of them, they can focus on it. Well, I got a project in front of me right now. I'm making a video. I'm very focused. But as soon as somebody comes in, as soon as you are thrust into a social environment, maybe you have to leave your space, or maybe somebody else comes into your space, or many people come into your space, what you find is you can no longer concentrate and focus like you once did. That's the confusion room. Now, I think everybody has this to a point. I don't know if you've ever been working on something, maybe in classroom setting, and you're writing away, and the teacher comes up behind you and looks over your shoulder. And suddenly, you're confused. What was I writing? What was I saying here? What was I doing? What was the problem I was trying to solve here? That's because that other person is in your presence. I don't think that's just an Aspie thing. I think that's an everybody thing. But people with Aspergers Syndrome, my guess is that's more likely to happen to them. It is more intense from my observation. Anyhow, I'm pushing 70 years old. Life has been my laboratory. I observe what people do, how they think, how they express themselves. And that's how I find many of my conclusions, in addition to self-study. Well, study kind of doing what you're doing right this very moment. So we have this confusion room. Have you ever been thinking logically, all alone, thinking logically, and you're building one precept upon another, and then you get to a point where it just all falls apart, like you didn't build anything? That, I think, is due to confusion. So we just went into our confusion room, and we lost all of our concentration. So what is the summation here? Well, the summation, in my opinion, is that this is what I would call a survival mechanism, that nature has endowed us with the ability to survive in this world with our Asperger's brain by compartmentalizing. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing. I think it's just a thing. And I just got to stop here and emphasize that I don't think people with Asperger's Syndrome have a disability. Now, there's some things we're not able to do, but everybody has that type of disability. But I mean as something that creates an environment in which we cannot function adequately. Yeah, we can do that. Maybe everything is not together like it is in the neurotypical world, but hey, you can turn that backwards. People who are neurotypical don't have all the advantages that people with Asperger's syndrome have. So, from that sense, I'd say, nah, this is not a disability. Okay, with that having said, let me ask you this. Right this very second, what room are you in? Are you in the self-confident room? Are you in the social room? Or are you in the confusion room? Now, my guess is, if you're alone watching this video, you're in the confident room. But as soon as somebody walks in where you are, could be the confusion room because that's the social room. Or it could be you could be moving back and forth from one room to the other. Yeah, that is confusing. What is the difference between people with Asperger's syndrome and those who are on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, but are not high functioning? What are the differences? Well, we have identified 8 of them. I'm sure there are more, but these are the more obvious differences so that you can tell this person, they seem to be on the spectrum, but I don't think they're severe. I think they have Asperger's syndrome. So what are these 8 differences? Number 1 is this. Connection, or we could say connectivity. So I say connection, and that is that people with Asperger's syndrome as compared to autistics, and those are the 2 terms, by the way, we're going to use. People with Asperger's syndrome tend to be more connected to the world. They have a worldview, that is to say, they sometimes have very defined religious views, whereas those who are autistics seem to be disconnected. They don't have political views, they don't have social views, they don't have religious views unless somebody else is imposing them on those individuals. And that's perfectly okay. In fact, maybe it'd be better if we didn't have such defined views. Maybe we would all get along. But that is one of the differences. Number 2 is this, intelligence. Aspies tend to be a little bit brighter. Well, not a little bit brighter, sometimes significantly more intelligent than the people with autism, those who are not high functioning. That becomes very apparent, and that is one of the markers, and that is one of the reasons why they can't always detect autism or Asperger's syndrome until later in life. And that, by the way, is number 3, age of onset. People with autism usually have their traits detected early in life. I'm talking ages 3 and 4, preschoolers. And the reason is, number 1, it's kind of obvious that they're not making eye contact like other children would. They may be slower to develop social skills. They don't like to play with other children the way that typical, neurotypical children would. And so parents find it very concerning because it is so very obvious that there's something amiss here, and they don't know what it is, so they consult, or they may know what it is if they're attuned to what's going on, but if they don't, they typically will contact somebody because, well, they love their children, they care about them, and if there's something wrong there, they want to know what it is so they can get help for their kids, so they can live a normal life or something close to a normal life. And so they get help early in life, and that makes such a huge difference. But people with Asperger's syndrome, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, as you have heard me say in other videos, I was not diagnosed officially until I was 66 years old. Now, I'm almost 70 years old now, and life has become kind of my laboratory. And many of the things I talk about in this series of videos, not only from what I've read and learned from study, but also from life experience. I call it life's laboratory. So I received my official diagnosis at age 66. Now, I knew that I had Asperger's syndrome long before that. I just never had it diagnosed. But once I had a meltdown, okay, I said, I got to go talk to somebody. And so I took a few months and I did my research and my due diligence, and I found a very good therapist who specialized in autism. We did a video and you're going to want to watch this. You'll have to go to our YouTube channel and find the video. Not hard to find. The video is about what to do and how to find a therapist and what to do and what to expect before you go talk to the therapist. That is a very helpful, beneficial video. So age of onset is one of the key differences. Why does it take so long to identify somebody with Asperger's Syndrome? It is because it's hard to tell. They say, I think this guy is he's just kind of quiet. I think maybe he's just shy. Or they will say, hey, just well behaved, or her. Or they may say, when you get into your teens, they say, well, he's just mature for his age because he doesn't get into trouble like the other kids. Where in reality, that person may just be withdrawn from his social environment, his milieu, because he or she has Asperger's Syndrome. But nobody detects it. They just think, what a good kid. They don't realize that this individual in their head is having some serious difficulties navigating through life, particularly socially. Number 4 is cognitive functioning. Autistics often have difficulty responding to other people. This includes many times low executive function, frontal cortex. Then again, there's this thing called emotional meltdowns that afflict people sometimes with Asperger's Syndrome. So, people who are autistic, not high functioning, they have some real challenges with cognitive functioning. But that's not to say people with Asperger's don't. We also have some difficulties. They're just not as noticeable, maybe not as persistent, not as pervasive, but they're still there. And often they come out in an emotional outburst. That's not a good thing for anybody to experience, especially if you are in a public place. You have Asperger's Syndrome, and say you're at a shopping mall, or if you're in an airport, they have tight security in airports. And you have a meltdown in an airport, you're going to be surrounded by security, or you're at least going to be on their radar, more so than others. They're going to pay very close attention to you. So there are some behavior patterns that betray that they're on the spectrum, but they're not as pervasive. They're not as ubiquitous. Number 5 is this: vocabulary. Autistics find it challenging to come up with words. They don't necessarily know what words it is they're supposed to use. They have a very limited vocabulary. Well, the difference between autistics and people with Asperger's Syndrome is that we tend to have, those of us on the Asperger's Syndrome spectrum, that end of the spectrum, tend to have a higher than normal vocabulary. Now, I've got a theory about that. I don't know if this has ever been tested and proven, but I think it's because the reason we have a higher vocabulary may not just be cognitive functioning, but it could be that we like things neat and in order. And there's certain words that better describe things, so that kind of puts our world in a more orderly perspective from our point of view. And so we use these big words that some people, not necessarily big words, but uncommonly used words that other people normally don't use in their daily talk, their daily conversation. Now, as children, that makes us seem to be extremely intelligent, and maybe that's one of the reasons, higher IQ. And it also turns out that adults prefer to talk to children with higher vocabularies because, well, they're just easier to communicate with. They sound smart, they sound like adults, so they talk to them, but they're still kids. They still have limited life experience, but they're fun to talk to. And again, sometimes the very traits of Aspergers Syndrome is what hides it, because it's misunderstood. It's misdiagnosed as being something that it's not. Number 6 again is verbal communication. Number 5 is vocabulary. So Aspergians find it difficult to socialize. Very difficult to socialize. Now, if you have Aspergers Syndrome, if you're an Aspie, you may have experienced something like this. You have watched television, or you have watched a movie in the theater, or you have maybe even watched a stage play, and you're observing it. You're not part of the TV show. You're not part of Ozzie and Harriet or the Brady Bunch or whatever you happen to watch. Okay, I'm dating myself, but you get the idea. You're not a part of that show. You're not a part of the stage play. You're not part of the movie. You're not there with Batman or whatever movie. But it seems like, are you listening? Because this is important. It seems like life is a movie. And the difference is between observing it on a screen is that you are actually in the movie, but you're just an observer. You're not a participant. You're not one of the actors. The only difference is you're watching the movie from inside the movie. That is what it's like many times to have Aspergers Syndrome. And people wonder, why is this guy so aloof? Why is she so distant? It's because she's not participating, or he is not participating, because you don't participate in a movie, you watch it. You don't participate in the play. If you do, they kick you out. You don't participate in Ozzie and Harriet. I mean, that was recorded years ago. And so you're just an observer. It's just a movie, just a TV show. So there is this thing with verbal communication. We don't communicate because, well, we're not participating. We're not part of it. We're just there to watch. Number 7 is skills and abilities. Autistics usually have very difficult times taking care of themselves personally. For example, they may not be able to brush their teeth. Severe cases, they may not be able to comb their hair. They may not be able to dress themselves. Whereas high functioning, and that's why they call it high functioning autistics can do all those things. Okay, maybe not comb their hair, but everything else they can do. People with Aspergers Syndrome are notorious for having bad hair. And it's not necessarily bad hair, it's just that we don't seem to find the need to have perfect hair. We want to have comfortable hair. Hairspray is okay, but, I'd rather it be free-flowing. Now, I kind of found this out the hard way because I thought I was pretty good with hair. And I would go to great lengths to make my hair look perfect. But fortunately, there was a hairstylist who straightened me out on that and said, Ken, let me give you a free haircut. And she told me why my hair looked bad. And I looked in the mirror and she's right. As good as I thought I was at it, it's just something I wasn't very good at. So, skills and abilities, people with Asperger Syndrome, with the exception of hair, tend to be very high functioning, or typical functioning, I should say, like everybody else. Now, we also tend to dress differently, now comparing not to autistics, but with neurotypical people, and we may do a video on those differences. But they think we dress funny because we dress comfortably. And the way that I like to express it is neurotypical clothing is like wearing sandpaper with a sandy part on the inside. Scratchy, itchy, very uncomfortable, particularly on hot summer days. All right, that takes us to number 8, and we already touched on this briefly, but number 8 is speech delay. Autistics typically are late in learning to speak. That's why it is so easily to detect it early on, as we said before. Whereas Aspergians develop their speech normally. In fact, they may be even a little bit advanced or substantially advanced, particularly, I think, if they have higher intellects. And as we said earlier, they have much larger vocabularies than their peers. And sometimes their peers will find that very annoying, but repeating what we said earlier, adults seem to find it very pleasant. They like to talk with children with Aspergers Syndrome because they talk on their level or close to it. Can you identify with this statement I'm about to make? When I was little, people would say that I was very well behaved. And then when I became a teenager, people would frequently say that, I'm speaking of adults, that I was mature beyond my years, that I was very grown up. But then when I became grown up, people would tend to say sometimes that I behaved a little bit aloof or maybe just out of touch. My behavior really didn't change that much. It was the perception. Framed by my age, the people drew that conclusion. Now, can you identify with that? There were kids in my school and in my neighborhood and in my church, or wherever I encountered kids who were kind of rowdy. We would say they are extroverts. And people would say when they were little that they are so misbehaved. And when they were teenagers, they would say they are so immature. They need to grow up. But now that those same kids are adults, they say that they're very charismatic. They are extroverts. They make good salespeople. Can you identify with that? What is the difference? What's going on here? Well, as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that, in fact, this occurred to me a very long time ago, that there was a spectrum, and on one end there were people who were very charismatic. And their charisma seemed to carry them through life. Okay, here's a story. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think I read it on Wikipedia. But I'm thinking of an actor you know by the name of Dick Van Dyke. Particularly if you were older, you'll remember him from television. Speaking of age, I'm almost 70 years old, so I've got some experience here. But the story was that when he was younger, he was auditioning for a Broadway play. Well, it was a musical. And it required him to dance. Now, everybody knows that Dick Van Dyke is an excellent dancer because we have seen him. But at the time, he was not a dancer. As far as I know, he had never studied dancing. He had never done any dancing whatsoever other than maybe, well, no more than any other young man. And so he went in to audition for this musical that required him to be a dancer, even though he could not dance, and they hired him on the spot. Now, the story is the reason they hired him, not because he could dance, because he couldn't, but because of his personality, because of his charisma. And I heard a similar story about a rock star, not going to mention his name, because I'm not positively sure this is accurate, but suffice it to say, he grew up in Seymour, Indiana. You can Google it later to find out who it is if you want. But the story is, early in his career, he cut a record or a recording. I think he had a tape. It wasn't actually a record. And he took it to a producer to audition the recording, because he wanted a recording contract. He was just beginning his career, and he wanted someone to take him on. And the story is that the producers, the production company, didn't listen to his audition recording, his audition tape. But like Dick Van Dyke, they signed him based upon his charismatic personality. And again, I don't know if that's true, but I know such things happen frequently, but I'm like 99% that's an accurate story. So we see here that it seems that people who are charismatic seem to often, not always, have an edge in life based upon their personality. Now, I have met people like that, but in Hollywood they call this just it. People have it. They have that personality that falls in love with a camera, falls in love with the people who are watching the movie screen. And so I'm wondering, people like us who are on this spectrum, particularly those of us who have Asperger's Syndrome, are we at a disadvantage because we are not charismatic? And what is, by the way, what is the opposite of the word charismatic? I tried to find it, and I didn't like the answers because one of them was repulsive, and that doesn't really fit because I know a lot of introverts who are not repulsive at all, so I don't know. But so we're going to use the terms introvert and extrovert because those are familiar to most everybody. But you know what I'm saying. I'm talking about people with Asperger's Syndrome versus those who have extroverted, charismatic personalities. And with few exceptions, we're just opposite ends of the spectrum. And there is a spectrum, by the way. There's some people who are very charismatic, kind of charismatic, just in the middle, and so forth. And this was first brought to public attention by Carl Jung, a psychologist who, I think he died in 1960s, 1961. But I think he brought this to the world's attention like in 1920, so it's been around for like 100 years. It's nothing new whatsoever. So what is the difference between people with Asperger's Syndrome and those who are charismatic, between those who are introverts and those who are extroverts? And again, I got to emphasize that not everybody with Asperger's Syndrome is an introvert. In fact, there are cases, and if you are familiar with Asperger's Syndrome, which I assume you are, you wouldn't be watching the video, but if you are familiar with people with Asperger's Syndrome and the syndrome itself, you know that some people express their Asperger's by being outgoing, sometimes to a fault. They can be very, very noisy, and they can be very bothersome to the teacher. It's kind of like the kid that the people said he's a troublemaker. But by and large, well, virtually every person I ever met who has Asperger's Syndrome was an introvert. But just so you understand, there are some exceptions. Well, let's take a look at these things. The differences between those who are extroverted and those who are introverted, or those who are charismatic and those who are the typical, the normal Aspies. Number one is this: inward versus outward loop. Now, I use the term loop, and why do I use the term loop? It's for this reason. According to Jung, Carl Jung, people who are extroverted, they need to express themselves. It's like something inside of them they just can't help but get it out. And so they are very talkative, very friendly, very outgoing, because I have to be. It's like there's a nervous energy. I don't think Jung said this, but there's like a nervous energy that they just got to kind of explode on other people. And then they get positive feedback. And that encourages them to be even more charismatic, outgoing, which, more feedback. And that's part of the story. But I got to tell you that I have encountered people over my life, and I'm sure you have too, like those Hollywood people, you know, that have the it that we were talking about. Individuals who just command respect by virtue of their presence. Now, I haven't met very many people who are excessively like this. In fact, in my entire life, and again, I'm like almost 70 years old. My entire life, I've only met one person that truly, genuinely fit rather that profile. I went to school at a place called Liberty University back when it was a college, and I would encounter, you may remember, Jerry Falwell. That is the only person that I ever met in my life who had that charismatic presence, where just by virtue that he was in the room, he commanded respect. I don't know what that was, but I remember there were some kids, some of the guys at school, who tried to emulate that. They tried to copy it. Oh, they were not the same. It was kind of obvious that they were being fake. So the point is, this is something that cannot be faked. Okay, number two is this. Number one was inward versus outward loop, because people who are charismatic, with exceptions, who are extroverts, tend to have that loop where they need to express themselves and it feeds back. And people who are introverts, just the opposite. We feed ourselves inwardly and we find that rewarding, and so we express ourselves inwardly. And that brings us to number two, and that is piano versus basketball. I often wondered what piano players did. People were extremely gifted at playing the piano before there were pianos. That seems to be so very unfair. I mean, I've heard people just really unbelievably, amazingly talented. And it just bothers me knowing that those people, or people like them, lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago when pianos weren't invented yet. Well, that's kind of off topic, but the point is people who are good at piano tend to be, and again with exceptions, but they tend to be introverted because it requires them to study alone. I mean, it's really hard to practice piano when there's a lot of noise around you. But basketball players, on the other hand, when I was a kid, I loved to play basketball, but I typically played basketball by myself. But by and large, if you're going to be a ball player, particularly on a school team or professional, you got to be social. You got to be outgoing to some point. Now, you can still be an introvert, you can still be an Aspie, but by and large, because, well, it's a team sport. It's a social sport. It's a team sport. So people are different. Now, that brings us to this question, and are we talking about nature or nurture? And I tend to believe, and I'll tell you why, I tend to believe it's almost entirely nature that we're born this way. And the reason is, many, many years ago, there was or I should say there were, two little puppies that found their way into our flower garden in front of our house. And if I recall, one of them was white, one of them was black, and I don't remember the difference other than that, or which was which, I should say. But it was kind of obvious that somebody had dumped them. You know, somebody didn't want them, and they didn't know what to do with them, couldn't find anybody to take them, and so they just dumped them. And we live near a rural area that happens rather frequently, but I don't know, maybe they just ran away from home, but we couldn't find a place for them. Finally, somebody came and got them. But the reason I bring up the puppies is because one of the puppies was very, very, very aggressive. Not in a bad way, just really friendly, like to jump around, and just happy, happy, happy puppy. And the other, and again, I don't remember if it was the white one or the black one, but the other puppy was just the opposite, just the opposite, and just really reserved. Just kind of wanted to do nothing but lay around, and he didn't seem to be sick, didn't seem to be anything wrong with him. He just wasn't an extrovert. So realizing those were puppies, and they couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, maybe a couple months at the most, they really didn't have time to be impressed by their environment. And considering they were obviously siblings because they looked alike other than their color, and they were the same age, so they probably came from the same litter, they were probably treated the same. So maybe not with 100% certainty, but it's almost 100% certainty that their behavior, you know, the one with charisma, the one that was outgoing, the one that was an extrovert, was that way by nature. And the one who was an introvert, same thing, by nature. Now, yeah, environment does influence everybody. We know that. No argument about that. But I think when we are dealing with ourselves, when we're dealing with who we are as introverts or extroverts, that it is probably very beneficial to ask ourselves, why am I like this? Why are we like this? And I think this is just the way that nature has produced us. Combination of genetic factors. It's in our DNA. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing, just a thing. But Again, those who tend to be charismatic, those who tend to be outgoing, those who tend to be extroverts tend to get a better shake in life. Okay, if you're an Aspie, you know how difficult it is to keep a job. You could go to work and you could be the best employee in the sense that you're a hard worker and you know your job and you have a good attitude and you show up on work on time. You don't show up intoxicated or whatever. You're just flat out good employee. But within 6 months, they want to get rid of you because you just don't have that social, what would you call that? Social ability? Put those two words together. Sociability, I guess. I don't know. But you just don't seem to have that, so you make people uncomfortable. People don't like to be uncomfortable, so they're left with two options. Number one, they can quit the job, get away from you. Or number two, they can try to get you fired. And inevitably, very few people are going to quit their job so they can get away from an introvert. So they decide that you're a bad apple somehow, and so they want to get rid of you. And I know a lot of people with Aspergers Syndrome. I don't know them personally, but I've heard about them who just can't keep a job. They're well trained. They're highly intelligent. They're really good at what they do. Got that great attitude, but they're not charismatic. In fact, they're the opposite end of whatever word we decided that is, of the opposite end of the spectrum, whatever that is, that's what they are. And so, they're rejected. That is piano versus basketball. Best analogy I could come up with. Well, if you can think of a better one, leave it in the comment section. Number 3 is rewards versus punishment. That's really kind of what we just talked about, but that is that if you are charismatic, if you are an extrovert, chances are you're going to fare better in life simply because you're better at making friends. Now, a lot of advancement in life, talking about financial advancement, career advancements, is based upon who you know. You got to be social. You got to be, with very, very few exceptions, you got to be social because people know people and they will, give you a job suggestion, or maybe they're working someplace and they will put in a good word for you to get you hired. Then once you get in, everybody likes you and everybody says, this is a great guy. And even though this great guy, this charismatic, likable person that everybody just loves, may be dumber than a box of rocks, but everybody likes him, so he gets promoted. Now, some of these people aren't dumb. Some of them are highly intelligent, and they deserve to be promoted. But the point is, those of us who tend to be introverted, we get overlooked simply because we are who we are. Is that fair? Well, guess what? Life is not fair, so we have to work around it. Now, personally, the way I was able to work around that is I was self-employed. I just worked for myself. And I worked with people, but they were my employees. So if they don't like me, who are they going to complain to? The government? The government doesn't care. I mean, maybe if I did something criminal, they probably would, but I didn't. And so, I was able to get around that social trap. Not so in my early years. I found it very difficult to keep a job, but once I was self-employed, hey, it worked very well. All right, so number 3 is what we call rewards versus punishment. Number 4 is this. And by the way, these are in no particular order, just thoughts as they came to my mind, is what I call talk versus think. Now, when I say talk versus think, I mean extroverts talk. Always, 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 there are exceptions. But extroverts talk, and then they think, maybe. Whereas introverts think, and then they talk. Maybe. So we're like opposites when it comes to thinking and talking. Most extroverts that I know, they just don't seem to think. I mean, their brain has to be working or they couldn't talk at all, but they just blurt out whatever. And everyone's okay with that because, well, they just make them feel warm and fuzzy, make people feel good about themselves. And in so doing, they may say something that is totally untrue, or something that is totally wrong, or something that normally would be considered rather offensive, something that if I were to say, people would be shocked. Can't believe he said that. But the extrovert says it, gets away with it. Then later he may think, probably shouldn't have said that, if he thinks at all. Whereas introverts, those of us who are Aspies primarily, we tend to be thinkers. Again, the piano player, the guy who is into computers, needs to focus, needs to concentrate, can't have a lot of noise, racket around him, can't have chitter chatter and people talking and people explaining what their problems are in their home life as if anybody cares, and don't care. The person with Asperger's really doesn't care to hear about your latest surgery. Not that he doesn't care or she doesn't care, but they're focusing on their work. Don't need to hear about that. So people with Aspergers Syndrome tend to be writers or like to write because, well, you know, people outside will call them loners. Remember that thing I said at the very beginning? When you're little, they say that you're well behaved, and when you're a teenager, they say you're mature, and when you're adult, they say that you're aloof. Well, sometimes as an adult, they say you are a loner. This guy just, I heard that a lot when I was in college, particularly from the staff. They say, well, you know, they would kind of analyze the students, and they would notice that this guy, Ken, he's just always by himself. Not always, but primarily by myself. I was, and they were right, I guess. I am a loner. I don't think that's a bad thing. They seem to think it, like it was some kind of a flaw, like I was mentally ill. What's wrong with this guy? Why doesn't he socialize like normal people? So, okay, yeah, we tend to be loners, and as such, we like to focus on what we're doing. For example, making this video. I cannot do well making a video like this if there are a bunch of people trying to talk to me or talking to each other around me. It'd be very distracting. As it is, the most distracting thing I have to deal with is if the neighbor's dog starts barking, and I don't find that distracting. I find it actually kind of adds to the interest of the video. All right, that was number 4. Talk versus think. We're inverted. What they are, we aren't. What they are, we aren't. Number 5 is competition versus cooperation. Just very briefly, one of the things I've noticed is that extroverts tend to make excellent warriors. Now, when I say warrior, I don't necessarily mean on the battlefield. Could be competition of business. Virtually every business leader, with some exceptions, is not only an extrovert, but many of them are flat out psychopaths. Now, I can think of notable exceptions. I can't think of the guy's name. Who's the guy that heads up Tesla? I'll think of it after the video is over, but if you can remind me, just put it in the comments. But they say he has Aspergers Syndrome. So there is one notable exception of a guy who made it to the top. But I'm thinking in his early days that it was like he and one other person were working on computer code, and they did that, like 18 hours a day. That's the story, anyhow. But cooperation versus competition. Extroverts make good warriors. They like to compete. They like sports. It's a team sport, and they like to win. They don't just like to compete. They like to defeat the other guy. Whereas introverts, well, we tend to make good peacemakers. We don't like to fight. We don't like the jostling back and forth with, again, always with some exception, but introverts tend to be peacemakers because fighting, at least to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's just dumb. I mean, why would you do that? Wherever you go, you're surrounded by your circumstances. So you say, I'm going to rise above my circumstances. No, you're not, because when you rise up, guess what? You're still surrounded by something. And that's what the word circumstance means. It means your surroundings, your circle, your circumstance. So you can't leave your circumstances. Well, if you do, you're still surrounded by circumstances. So you say, okay, I'm going to move out of this neighborhood. I'm going to go to an entirely different state, maybe a different country, because I don't like my circumstances. Well, guess what? Whenever you get wherever you're going, you're going to have circumstances. Be different, but there's still going to be circumstances. And chances are, with the challenges that you're confronting with your circumstances now, you're going to face the same thing where you get, well, your destination. Maybe you need some relief. Say if you're in a high crime rate area, then you want to move somewhere safer. That would be the obvious exception. Many things like that. But if you're dealing with things that have to do with you personally, well, if I just move somewhere else, people will see me differently. Maybe, but I'm thinking they're going to still see you as an introvert. If you're an adult, they may very well see you as a loner or as aloof. So go ahead, change your circumstances, but you're just taking them with you. They are your baggage, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think could be, but I think it's largely a good thing. Competition versus cooperation. We tend to be cooperators. I don't understand why people hate those with whom they disagree. You know, I know people who are fans of ball teams, and they sometimes come to physical blows over a ball game. How dumb is that? I mean, how silly is that? I know people involved in politics or religion or whatever. They get mad at each other. They just disagree. I mean, why do people have to hate each other? Because they have different thoughts. They have different wavelengths going through their brain. I don't get it. But obviously, extroverts do. Makes perfect sense to them. Not to me. And so we say there is a difference between extroverts and introverts because there is a desire for competition among extroverts, whereas introverts like to be peacemakers, cooperation. Number 6, and finally, is this. Hey, this is a good one. Embrace versus escape. Extroverts, as we said earlier when we first began this presentation, extroverts derive their energy from, not just from crowds, but they seem to derive energy from loud crowds. Okay, remember the analogy of the ball team? I'm thinking basketball because I'm in Indiana, but if you're in Alabama, you're probably thinking football. But okay, in Indiana, we're thinking basketball. Nothing worse than a quiet crowd. They come to see, the fans in the stands, which I don't know why they call them stands because nobody's standing. Well, sometimes they do, but they go there to sit. Why don't they call them sits instead of stands? I don't know. So anyhow, they go and they're in the sits or the stands, whatever. And if they're good fans, they make a lot of noise because the extroverts who are on the ball team thrive in all that racket. I have never, ever, ever been in a bar. A place where you go get alcohol. Can't remember ever being in one. But I've seen them on television. And from what I've seen, they're loud places. And I guess people who go there, okay, the alcohol kind of helps them along, be extroverts, but they're loud and noisy. I remember when I was a kid watching Westerns on TV, and they would always have a brawl. Every single Western I ever watched, again, with exceptions, they always had a barroom brawl. Always. I figured that's just what you do when you go to a barroom. You go in there, have a drink, and everybody fights each other. All right, it wasn't that naive, but that's the way it seemed. But that's what stimulates an extrovert. They like that noise. They like the competition. They like the fight. They like the racket. They like the busyness. They like to contribute to that, and they feed off of that. And that helps them, encourages them, motivates them, challenges them to do more of what they do, which is go to bars and fight. Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. They like to be extroverted. Whereas Aspies, those of us who are introverted, we find crowds, yeah, they're stimulating, but they're overstimulating. I don't know too many people who don't like to go to theme parks. Oh, let's go to Disneyland and stand in line for 2 hours and nobody speaks English. Why would anybody want to do that? Let's go to, there's a fair in town. Let's go to the fair and we'll just have fun wasting our money. All the noise and the lights, people love that stuff. And the popcorn, it's expensive. What do they call it? Cotton candy? Okay, I like the cotton candy. But outside of that, fireworks? Are you kidding me? I don't want to go to fireworks. But people love them. And I'm as patriotic as you can get, but I'm a quiet patriot. I don't like that stuff. But it's stimulating, but it's overstimulating. It's just too loud. We have a lot of videos on this channel. And our videos are what are called evergreen. That means they're fresh. They just stay fresh. You can watch them anytime, and they're just as powerful today as they were when we first made them. And you can see some of those videos by clicking on the links that are on your screen right now.